Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight or whenever you're watching the replay. We are going to be talking with returning guest, Justine Pucella Winans, whose book, One Killer Problem, I actually happen to have it. It released today. Yay. It's one that I got to read the arc of, and I decided I wanted a copy when it came out. So I'm very excited. And it's just fun to have somebody come and talk to us again after we've had them before, talk about new work, different work, growth in work, and all that good stuff. But tonight, let's start by, can you just give like the flap copy or extended flap copy version of what the book's about so people kind of know what we're going to be talking about tonight?
Yeah, of course. I also have my copy, so I'll show the
Yay!
cover while I'm talking. But One Killer Problem is a comedic YA mystery that follows the protagonist, Gigi, who I say has IBS and an attitude, as she enlists the help of her also queer and cozy mystery obsessed best friends to look into a very suspicious sudden death of her favorite math teacher.
Yay! Tell us a little bit about, because I think it's very funny and fun. The friends are involved in a mystery club,
Yes.
um, but its credentials are dubious at best at the beginning. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the full name of the club is the Mystery and Thriller Literary Scholars because essentially it's a glorified book club of only two students looking to expand that are very big readers of cozy mysteries. In particular, one cozy mystery series called The Perfect Meowder, which is a like cat pun veterinarian assistant who like solves murders
Oh,
around
that's awesome.
her town. So it was like a fictional series within the book that I had fun making like cat pun murder titles for different books
That's
that
really
are
cool.
brought up. And while, their focus is more so reading and appreciating cozy mysteries, and Mari, the club president, has a really good way of framing it for college applications. They Gigi sort of brings in their help, thinking, they read enough mysteries. People that read a lot of mysteries tend to know who did it at the end, tend to be able to figure out mysteries. So maybe they can help me figure out this one. So although it is really more of a cozy mystery kind of book club, masquerading as like a totally serious after school literature
Yeah.
program, they do sort of become an actual mystery club or like involved
Yeah.
in investigating this particular murder mystery.
That's so awesome. I love that. I love that. Well, I mean, I love that about the book, and we'll keep talking a little bit about that a little bit later. But this sort of mix of like humor, quirky humor, and the fact that this mystery club is going to solve this mystery is part of that, I think, for me. But let's talk a little bit about Gigi and what your inspiration was for her character.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I joke that my books last year, which were Bianca Tori is Afraid of Everything and the Otherwoods, were kind of like my year of like the scared and anxious queer characters. Where this year with One Killer Problem and then my middle grade coming out in the fall, Wishbone, is the year of my sort of angry queer main characters. And I really did want to explore a character that in a lot of ways was much more like different from me and kind of how I go about my day to day, but kind of feels sort of the anger and injustice that a lot of queer kids, in this country do feel and everywhere feel during the day, but also kind of expresses that through action, where I feel like she's sort of the character that does wake up and choose violence
Yeah.
sometimes and has to sort of grow throughout the story to at least like begin to realize sort of how she is handling things in like not the healthiest way, and while not losing sort of that ability to see when things are unfair and kind of hold that anger, but also realize when she can rely on other people and be able to sort of express her feelings in a healthier way, like
Yeah.
through a counselor character that is in the book. So I did have a lot of fun just kind of writing a character that did sort of jump into action before overthinking, because I think it was so different from my experience in writing Bianca Torre, who is kind of the opposite in overthinking everything and not
Yeah,
taking
yeah,
action. And I think that that does kind of, that is a little closer to home for me. So kind of being able to step out of my comfort zone in that way and sort of write a character that was really different in that regard of being confrontational, was a lot of fun. And I also just think that, especially teens, because I know as a teen, I had a lot of anger and attitude that was like not
yeah,
fully explained.
yeah.
If you ask my mom, she would, agree with that.
Yeah,
So I would love, like, or I always love to see when books have space for teens to have those kind of messy and complicated
yeah,
feelings. And it's just like, especially when there's a sense of humor along with it, it's really
yeah.
fun to write.
I'm curious because I was thinking about the fact that the Gigi character is really different from the others.
Mhm.
And you kind of touched on this a little bit already, but do you find that as you so this is I mean this is book 3 published, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm sure it's not book 3 like for most people it probably wouldn't be book 3 like at all.
Yeah, like a total of everything I
Yeah.
wrote, definitely
Yeah. And
not.
do you find that I just find it interesting how different pieces of ourselves show up in different books.
Hmm.
And you said that, Gigi is a very different character than you, where maybe Bianca drew on you more heavily. But do you find that there is some little piece of you no matter what you're
Yeah,
writing about?
I
And
do.
then the
Oh,
second
sorry.
part of that is, do you find that your inspiration for characters changes as you write more and more stories?
Yeah, I do think that all of my, especially like main characters, have a little like piece of me in some way or
Yeah.
another, and that sort of helps me write from an authentic place. Where, with Gigi, it's like maybe I'm not the confrontational person because I'm definitely not. I can admit to that, but I've still been angry. I still kind of, had that sort of like feeling of like, oh, I'm being like, ridiculous, or I know I'm being like irritable right now, but like I'm doing it anyway, or that kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
attitudes. I feel like there are still always like pieces, plus like having some shared identity aspects, like, writing a character that was like bisexual, has IBS, loves Pokemon and plushies. Those were kind of things in my own life that
Yeah.
I threw in to sort of, allow us to have that connection and be able to get into her head a little more. I think I also kind of put, pieces of myself or my experience in some of the supporting characters as well. One of my favorite supporting characters in this book is Gigi's older brother, Luca. Because I was like involved in theater when I actually was a like theater and film major in college. So up through college, I was like very involved in the film and theater scene. So I love having characters that are kind of a part of that world and also like make fun of it a little bit just because, I
Yeah.
did it for
Yeah.
so long. So I do think that a lot of kind of my personality kind of is sprinkled into characters just to sort of like bridge myself, with them, especially writing in first person present. You really do have to get into the
Yeah.
characters
Yeah.
having personality. But also, I'd say because I'm on sort of a schedule where, last year and this year at least, I've had 2 books out both years, and I've kind of, even beforehand with all of the manuscripts that were like not, published or
Yeah.
successful in
Yeah.
getting me an agent, like I tend to be someone that writes a little bit on the faster side. And I'm not really the person to take years and years on one project. And for that reason, I do think that sort of where I'm at in my life can also kind of influence like the
Yeah.
tone and
Yeah.
the character a little bit. Um, for this book, it did have kind of a more difficult writing process than I experienced with Bianca in the Otherwoods, and was a little bit more like ongoing. And maybe it was like, putting some of those frustrations and getting it, or that it was hard to sort of get right, into the character a little bit, where she kind of had those more natural, like frustrated moments that, I was kind of feeling towards myself, even
Yeah.
if it was in a very different way. So I feel like, any of my books, if I would have written them at a different time or a different year, even
Yeah.
maybe a different month, they could have felt like
Yeah,
a
that's really
totally
interesting.
different book. So that's why I try to just, be grateful for the book that I have at the time that I
Yeah.
did, and also a little more forgiving if, you look back and you're like, oh, maybe I should have done something different, but kind of framing it
Yeah.
as it being sort of the perfect way to do it for the time that I was writing it for, the place that I
Yeah.
was in.
Yeah.
Especially when publishing is something that kind of looks so much into the future. And like by the time that, you're talking about a book on its release day, it's like you might have been working on like two other projects or in
Yeah.
a whole other
Yeah.
project since then. So that is always kind of a fun thing to remember is like, if I do reread one of my books, it is sort of like getting a little peek into where I was
Yeah.
in my life
Is that
during the
weird
process.
sometimes for you? I know other writers, it can be kind of strange to be going a little like peeking back in time or
I think it's definitely strange, but I also kind of like it. And maybe because I read so much, like I'm a big reader, I also, will have like multiple projects kind of juggling. So a lot of times I forget aspects of what's
yeah,
inside the
yeah.
book. So, well, I know, of course, like the general plot and what happens, like there might be lines, and I'm like, wow, I don't remember writing that joke.
Yeah,
That's pretty
that's really
funny because
good.
I forgot about it.
Yeah.
So there is kind of that excitement if I do like look back. The only reason why I don't really go back and reread a lot of my work is because I'm always behind on my TBR. And so I'm like, oh, if I
Yeah.
go back and read One Killer Problem, then I can't read this new book that I just bought, and I still have books
Yeah.
from like last year that are sitting waiting to be read. Um, but if I do at least go back and get to look at some passages, that's can be a little embarrassing, but also mostly fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you find yourself um what's the way to word this? Like, do you find yourself sometimes going back and saying, "Oh yeah, that worked out okay"? Because I know for me, sometimes I would be like, I would write something and think, "Oh, this is like just awful," and then I'd come back to it and I'd be like, "Okay, it was actually not bad."
Yeah, I feel like I always have that stage when I'm drafting a project where I'm like, this isn't working. This is like the worst thing in the world. It's terrible. And then like the next stage will be like, actually, this is really good. And then it just kind of goes
Yeah,
between those.
yeah,
So I try to at least, after it's already been published and there are no changes, to just like accept it as it is, where I'm like, you know what, it's
yeah,
in the
yeah,
reader's hands now. It's
yeah.
for the
It
readers
belong.
now.
Yeah, I
So
do think there's that. I get the feeling that this is hard for some authors. For me, it's never been a super big struggle of, it doesn't belong to me anymore. And probably that's partly because I have done just all work for hire. And so it doesn't belong to me like, but I think if you want to move forward, sometimes you have to say, okay, well, that's done. That's where I was. It belongs to the readers now. That's all good. Let's go on to the next thing. Or else you could probably spend your life like, oh, I could have rewritten that sentence better or whatever.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to just kind of have that mindset of, not every book is going to be for every person, and that's okay,
Yeah,
because if
exactly.
there are people that don't resonate with the book, it's like I try to remind myself like, hey, they still took a chance on it, which means there was
Yeah.
something about
Yeah.
it, that at least seemed
Exactly.
interesting.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's, like once a book is out there, I generally, like I will still love it and, talk about it, but in terms of like reactions and things like that. I just try to kind of put it aside and like focus on the next
Yeah.
one,
Yeah.
because that's what I still have control over, the books that are just manuscripts on my computer and I actually have to
Yes.
still make better, compared to, like you said, once it's published, it is sort of just like it's for the readers at this point, and hopefully it resonates with people. If it does, I love to hear about it, but if
Yeah.
not, like I'm still just happy that there was like that kind of moment in time
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
preserved in this story that gets to like exist in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, I think that, and I'm sure I won't be able to capture this adequately just off the top of my head, but I do think that's interesting in how books work. is that they end up being their own thing in this
Hmm.
weird way. Here's this inanimate object with words on a page that is paper, and yet it ends up being something sort of living in the sense that it continues to influence people, long after it's out of your hands and out of the editor's hands and out of the designer's hands and whatever, like now it's out there living its own life. And I
Yeah.
think that's really fascinating how books are like that.
Right. And I feel like that's like the magic of it is, as I'm writing it, it's like there's something that I'm trying to say that I later in therapy realized was like connected to some trauma maybe I had or
Yeah.
something. And then it's like through this book, it's sort of that like preserved conversation where like, yes, it's the character. I am not my characters, but it's like through like the reader, we're sort of able to have this like shared moment, this
Hmm.
conversation through the text without actually talking to each other.
Yeah.
And that's why even like I love being a reader as well, and always try to like share books that I like, because I love that ability to sort of escape into another world or another story and kind of get these emotions and feelings that were just kind of, yeah, that preserved in time from someone else writing them. And
Yeah.
I feel like just focusing on how that's just so cool of a thing
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
might make people feel a little better about some of the tougher reactions they might accidentally get
Yeah,
tied
yeah,
to
because I
more.
mean, because you're right. I think the interesting thing about it is every book has its, like, not every book is for every person,
Yeah.
which you had said. I think the other thing that I find really fascinating is I, as a bookseller, of course, we have access to, literally hundreds of titles, um, that are advanced reader copies. And
Mm-hmm.
so, it's like, I know when I got hired, it was like, well, these types of jobs don't pay very well, but you get lots of free books. And I'm like, yay, count me in. But I think what's really interesting to me is some of it also depends on where you are as a reader are.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'll have, weeks where I'm just like, I don't want to read anything dark, or I don't want to read
Yeah.
anything depressing because I feel cruddy. And so I want to read something that makes me feel safe and good. Whereas 3 weeks later, I might want to read something, dark and thrilling because,
Right.
like where you are as a reader also impacts how you interact with a book, and
Mm-hmm.
something you might not like, or you might read a chapter of, 3 months later, you might pick it up and love it.
Right.
So I think that whole dynamic is just so fascinating because it is partially about just readers' tastes, but partly it's about, where are we as readers? What do we need right then? What does this book,
Right.
or, and two readers will read the same book and they're in different places in their lives and they need something different. So they'll get something completely different out of it,
Yeah, and
even
I,
though
I
they're
feel
in
like
the same book.
that's
So
happened to me where I would start something and be like, oh, maybe this isn't for me. But then, maybe like months pass or even, however much time. And then it's like, remember that book? I think I'm going to try it again. And then it becomes like
yeah.
one of my favorite books because I
Yes.
read it like when I needed it. And I
Yeah.
feel like that's just the great thing about books. Like, obviously, it's amazing if you buy them, the first week or pre order
Yeah.
release week, just
Yeah.
because it helps out. But at the same time, when it comes to actually like reading books, it's like your book collection, or even whether you get it through libraries, like I use Libby all the time for like my audiobooks and
Yeah.
things like that. Like they'll still be there for you when you're
Yeah.
ready, and when
Yeah.
you may need it. And if it's, if a certain book is never something that you really find you need, it'll be there for someone else who needs it.
Exactly.
But I
Exactly.
do love having that kind of ability to come back to things and realize, like maybe this kind of content isn't right for me at this moment, but that doesn't mean it'll never be something I want to
Yeah.
explore.
Yeah. I want to jump over a little bit and
Yeah.
talk a bit about voice, because I
Hmm.
think that, like, all your books have like certain kind of a voice, I think, in some ways, but this one I feel like is like Gigi just is, she's super voicey, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. And for those who are watching or will watch a little bit later, can you talk a little bit about voice? Like if they're not in the writer world where we sit around and obsess about voice. Can you talk
Right.
a little bit about what we mean by that? And then after that, like how much for you personally as an author, how much do you think about that? And how much does it just flow out of you as a writer and the character as it comes to you kind of creating its own voice as you're working?
Yeah, I'd say it's voice is one of those things that it's almost hard to describe.
Yeah,
And when
yeah,
people say like, "Oh, how do you get better at it?" You're like, "Wow, that's a
yeah,
really really like hard thing to think about." Because essentially to me, voice is just the way that the character speaks and sees the world, how they present things, how they talk about things, and sort of the style of writing through the main character's perspective. And it's always been sort of something that is very important to me, but I do think that that's something that comes a little more naturally when I get to know the character. And I think maybe it is in part of like having been, with a theatrical and like acting
yeah,
background, is
yeah.
I was always so drawn to characters. And I'm one of the people that has like a constant internal monologue going, and was one of those people shocked to realize that not
No,
everyone was,
I know.
because it's all I
What? Yeah,
know.
what's that? I don't know.
Right. So it to me, it's sort of like that's almost like how I think, is like kind of how
Yeah,
I write sometimes. And while it definitely needs to be like cleaned up, and my writing is not all just like thought process, it did sort of allow me to more easily kind of slip into a character's voice, where I had to do a lot of my growth as a writer was more through like plotting and pacing and logic and all of those things that
yeah,
turned me into an outliner for sure. Because that was where I needed to really like put down the all of my thoughts, and get organized and get that together, where when it came to like characterization, that was something that always kind of felt a little more natural, especially with like my main characters and getting in their head. And I feel like what really helped me looking back to, as we kind of touched on, having all of those manuscripts before my debut of Bianca that will never see the light of day, or maybe I'll steal names from them, but
yeah. Or
not
scenes or something.
right.
Yeah, yeah,
I think that a big thing that helped me with my voice was allowing to kind of like use my own sense of humor too, and kind of like put humor in books, especially like writing mysteries. I think when I first started writing as a teenager, I kind of thought that like, YA books needed to sound a certain way, or they needed
yeah,
to have
yeah.
that kind of like dark, gritty, dystopian, which I love, but I thought
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was like the only way.
Not, yeah.
And so then getting to a point where I was kind of like, no, I'm gonna write queer characters. I'm gonna make them tell jokes and be kind of like, maybe a little annoying at times, but it's fine. And that sort of just unlocked like more of an ability to really get inside the character's head and sort of make them feel more authentic and have that personality that just like kind of pops off the page. And it's just like not being afraid to sort of really like tell the joke, or kind of like get into their head and say things that are a little silly. And like for me in this specific kind of book, like that was really helpful. And if people are sort of worried about, voice while writing, I feel like it is kind of just like allow yourself to kind of be a little more of yourself in terms of like
Yes.
what makes you
Yeah,
laugh, what
yeah,
makes you like, kind of emotional or afraid, and sort of just allow your character to play with that, and put
yeah.
them in like, maybe have your character describe something random, or I like to put them in terrible situations and then see how they use their sense of humor to deal with
What did
that.
they do?
um because that's what I do. But I do think that while voice is something that did come a little easier to me, it is still something that, looking back at my pre-published work, I really had to grow in terms of not just trying to write like the books that I read,
Yeah.
um, in terms of like style, but allowing myself to kind of find my own style and humor, and let my characters sort of take that as far as I wanted, because it could always get pulled back in
Yeah.
revisions.
And I think that's, you said at the beginning, it's hard to explain voice. And I think that really what it ends up being is what what is your sort of innate personality as a writer. And
Mm-hmm.
the only way you figure that out is by writing.
Right.
Like writing a lot of bad stuff, writing a lot of stuff that doesn't sound like you until you figure out what sounds like you. And
Mhm.
I think it's an interesting thing to talk about because it's like we all want it, but you don't really, it's not like you can go to a class and say, this is how you do it, because
Right.
it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think it is
so
one of those things that it's like everyone just sort of has to figure it out themselves. And you could get some good advice, but no one can tell you what your
yeah,
voice
yeah.
is. So,
Yeah, because I mean, for me, it was like I started off being, I was gonna read, I love fantasy, so naturally I'm gonna write fantasy, and I don't, like my voice doesn't work for that. Like it works for explaining things to people, and so
right.
I eventually fell into writing nonfiction. It was because that's where my voice could be good, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. Whereas in
Yeah,
fiction, it's kind of a little flat, but nonfiction, it works. But you don't go through the process of saying, oh, this is what my voice sounds like. Like, where does it fit? Like, it's just this journey
yeah,
that you go on and that you eventually figure out. But you can't shortcut it. You just
right.
have to kind of,
And sometimes you just
yeah.
kind of you see where it works because I feel like my like YA voice a lot almost sounds more like contemporary,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
having like
Yeah.
humor.
That's fair. Yeah.
But before I wrote Bianca Torre, I was kind of having issues with plotting, and it was like, I need things to happen. And then I was like, you know what? I love like dark, kind of spooky, creepy stuff. I'm gonna write a murder mystery,
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I did sort of take a chance and kind of seeing if I could blend those sort of like funny contemporary with like an actual murder mystery going on. But sometimes it's like just kind of finding that sweet spot where the cross
Yeah.
genre still
Yeah, for
works.
sure.
And I do think that also like, horror comedy and sort of like thriller comedies like can be very effective. They're really big in, the film world. So
Yes.
and
Yeah.
I feel like I see more on the adult side as well. So it kind of like makes sense for that
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
translate even more because they're definitely out there in YA and middle grade. I personally would just love for there to be more.
A lot
But
more. Yeah, no, it's funny because I was watching Sister Boniface before I came in, and I think there's a lot of parallels, right?
Mhm.
It's those they've got I mean I think that's probably a little bit more silly than this, but
Right.
it says the same quirky humor. Yes, there's this serious, terrible thing that's happening, but like nothing around it is as serious. Like people, it's
Right. Like
still got a
the
lot of humor in it, and
yeah.
yeah. So I think a lot of the British mysteries kind of play on that, where
Mhm.
you have this story, but then it's got some of these. There's some fun and funniness to it as
And
well.
that's kind of why I love like putting a lot of like the cozy mystery kind of references. And One Killer Problem is I remember even like as a teenager, because I had like a note early on where someone was like, why would teens be obsessed with this like cozy mystery series? Or aren't like puns a little like childish for adult books? And I was like, first of all, how dare you? Because as a teenager, I was reading like I remember I had a friend of the family and she was like a big reader and we would read like Joanna Fluke's like the
Yeah,
like baking
yeah,
cozy mysteries and she would read it and then pass it to me and I was like 15 or like reading and being like,
yeah,
oh, I like
yeah,
this guy, not this guy for her.
yeah,
And just like kind of liking that it was still like lighthearted, even though there was a
yes,
murder going on, and that
yeah,
it allows itself to be sort of silly and suspend disbelief, where you could have all of these murders taking place in one town, and it just kind
yeah,
of,
yeah. A la
still
Jessica
fit.
Fletcher and Murder She Wrote.
Yes,
It's like
exactly.
terrible things are happening, but it's all
So
fine.
I did have a lot of fun kind of like referencing that. And I do think that Sean and Mari, that are the characters that are
Yeah,
big fans of this murder mystery series and cozy mysteries, I did enjoy kind of getting to put some of myself in being a big reader
yeah.
and still loving those. And I was like, actually, there are a lot of cozy mysteries that have puns, probably
Yes.
most of
Oh, for
them.
sure. Yeah.
So
That's a big thing in the cozy mystery land, which is very fun, I think. That's
yeah, I love puns. So I'm all for
yeah.
it.
That's awesome. I am curious. So I don't think it's giving too much away because I mean it's the main plot of the book is
Right.
that Gigi's trying to solve the mystery of her favorite teacher, Mr. Ford, who's the math teacher. Which, by the way, I think I texted you when I was reading the book that I was very sad that Mr. Ford was going to die because
Yeah.
he's a cool character. I'm like, no, you can't kill Mr. Ford. He's awesome. But did you have do you have people in teachers in your life, whether it's a particular teacher or like an amalgamation of different teachers that you kind of drew on for Mr. Ford? I'm just dying of curiosity if you had
Yeah, I'd
Mr.
say
Ford.
there was like one specific math teacher I had that I kind of like, we weren't even necessarily very close, but in terms of like personality, where he had such a great sense of humor, but was kind of harder on kids. And
Yeah.
I feel like
Yeah.
some people sort of took that in like the wrong way. But I thought he was really funny. And so I feel like
Yeah.
I used
Yeah.
kind of like that humor a little bit with Mr. Ford. And also the idea of kind of like I was the kid too that sometimes I'm like, if I didn't have to eat lunch at the cafeteria and I could eat with like a teacher and like, the advanced placement room or whatever, like I did
Yeah.
that a lot. So kind of having that thing where like, Gigi was going for like, extra help during lunch, but also just kind of like hanging out in the classroom
Yeah.
rather than having to
Yeah.
deal with like
Yeah.
the crowds of the
All
cafeteria.
the noise and yes.
Right. So I think there was definitely sort of like little like inspirations taken, and the one high school math teacher I had with a good sense of humor was definitely like a big
Yeah,
inspiration for
that's
that
awesome.
part.
It's
But
always the
yeah,
math teachers too.
yeah, and
Like it's always the
math
math
was
teachers
like
that have
my
the
least
good sense of
favorite
humor.
subject. So if someone, made me enjoy that class a little more, it meant a lot.
Yeah, no, I was laughing because my favorite teacher in high school was my math teacher. I also hated math. Like it
Yeah,
had nothing to do with the subject. We're actually
right.
still friends, so it's like, so yeah. But we killed him off, and that made me sad. I really
Yeah.
wanted you to kill off a mean teacher that we didn't like.
Well, so actually, this is funny because in the very first draft of this book, he actually was like a meaner teacher. Because I was kind of like, oh, that'll be fine if he dies. And then like I had gotten like kind of the revision notes with one of my editors that was like, I don't really see why Gigi would care as much,
Yeah,
even like
yeah,
coming across the
exactly.
body. And I
Yeah.
was like, that's a really good point.
Yes. No, and
So
I
it
thought of
sort
that
of
when I made the
changed
joke
from
about it
there.
having to be a mean teacher, but like why would she be motivated to figure it
Right.
out
So it,
if
it definitely didn't
yeah.
work as well.
Yeah. So you talk there's IBS rep in this book, and there's been anxiety rep in this book, just general awkwardness and anger, and like I think I know the answer to this question, but why do you think all that those different representations are important?
Yeah, I think generally having different, types of representation, whether it's like, specific disabilities or even just kind of like having those different emotional representations are important because, it shows readers that like that's normal, and it's not something where it's like, I wanted to write a character that, yeah, has to worry about using the bathroom and whether she brought like, her
Yeah.
things with her even when the mystery is going on, because a lot of times like a lot of kids and teens have like specific disabilities, and it's not going to stop just because the things that are
Right.
going on in their
Yeah.
life.
Yeah.
And same with just kind of having like different emotions, even emotions that you can't explain. I think a lot of times people like to act that like, oh yeah, maybe teenagers would act this way, but like I as an adult would never. And I'm like, okay, I think even as an adult, we have a
Yeah.
lot of emotions that we can't even explain, or
Yes.
don't always
Yeah.
handle things in the best way. And it's easy to kind of like look over that and be like, oh, so immature. But I'm like, honestly, I am an adult and I still do some immature things sometimes, or I will still feel some
Yeah.
emotions that I'm like, why am I feeling this way? And so I do think it is also just kind of a relatable thing to see of like not having a character that feels like, oh, this perfect representation of a teenage detective, but
Yeah.
someone
Yeah.
that is kind of like struggling through what they're doing and in their feelings sometimes. And so I do love kind of being able to include that messiness, especially when it comes to books that center queer characters, because I feel like a lot of times there is that expectation that they have to be like perfectly likable,
Yeah.
in order for people to still relate. And I honestly think it's more relatable if characters are a little
Yeah.
messy and not
Yeah.
always perfectly likable.
Yeah, that's a conversation my daughter and I were having recently of. like not requiring people to be the model minority, whether
Mhm.
it's any kind of minority. Like you
Right,
don't have to rep it, like you don't have to be perfect so that everybody can see how great, you are
right.
repping whatever minority that you're a part of. You're a person.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's it. But yeah, no, I appreciated that because I think that there's authenticity lended to any kind of minority. When we're writing about any of our own experience with anxiety and IBS and awkwardness, like any of that kind of stuff, I think the difference between having experienced that yourself and writing it into a character and sort of somebody who is outside that trying to write it into the character is the fact that you integrate it into her life. Like,
Hmm.
I think a lot of times when there's outside people trying their best to do rep, it's like, well, this person has this, but then you never hear about it for the rest of the book, or it
Right.
doesn't interfere with they just go about their day and it doesn't interfere with them. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
no, I mean, if you have a disability, if you have a chronic illness, if you have mental health issues, like they interfere with your daily life, like it's gonna still be there.
Right. And
So
I
yeah,
think like especially when it comes to like digestive issues, like, in this case IBS, like a lot of times people get kind of like embarrassed or want to like make you feel embarrassed like when talking about these things. And that's why like in the book I was like, as someone where it's like that's your reality, I wanted a character that it's like,
yeah,
okay, no, I'm gonna talk about these things,
yeah,
and
yeah,
if like you have to like make reference of like, yeah, I've had to poop in some terrible places because when you gotta go, it's
yeah,
like it
yeah,
happens, and not like, totally like making those kind of jokes and references shameful when it's just like part of your
yes,
everyday
yeah,
experience. So that was something that, I have fun with because a lot of times like I do like to use my sense of humor to kind of like deal with when I'm
yeah,
struggling and
yeah,
or when there's pain or whatever. And so being able to like allow Gigi to have that, so people that might also have some kind of like tummy issues like
yeah,
I do with
yeah. Oh, and
IBS.
there's so many things that aren't that exactly, but that fall under that, like
Right,
that
right.
impacts what you can eat, or other people can go, celiac, and somebody else can go eat all the things and you can't, or,
Yeah.
whatever else. And yeah,
Right. I
yeah,
think in the book I talked about like Gigi giving up coffee because that's something I had to do and like, limit caffeine a lot. And even like, being a writer, it's hard because a lot of people want to meet
yeah.
up at coffee shops. So you have to find the, and I
Oh,
love
some
coffee
water,
too.
please. Yeah,
But it was something I could kind of like, okay, I could put in the book and sort of make jokes about it, especially having like the iced coffee queer, like, stereotype. Getting to be like, okay, like, yeah, that'd be great. I'm really tired, but like, I can't.
yes, yeah,
And
yeah,
getting to include some of that was, a lot of like fun and maybe in some ways sort of like healing for me and getting
cathartic,
those,
yeah.
frustrations
Yeah.
out.
Well, I'm gonna broaden way, way out. Well,
Okay.
no, let's not do that yet. Let's one more thing about so I can we can tie up one killer problem conversation without just sort of leaving it without further reference. Is there something? I mean, I think we've touched on a lot of this as we've had our conversation, but for this particular book, is there something that you would really love people to come away with? All the fun and all the quirkiness and all the wonderfulness and little bit of camp and all the, happy endings and all of this kind of thing. Is there something that like for you personally as you're writing it and seeing going out of the world that's sort of at the heart of this particular book that you really want to see people maybe
Yeah.
kind of pick up on?
I think kind of the answer that's a little more like obvious in the character arc is that I want kind of people to sort of learn from Gigi's own journey and that it is okay to sort of take chances and let other people in, even if that might end up in it not working out or them hurting you. And kind of, realize that not everything has to be on you. And also, sometimes there are different ways to explore emotions that aren't always kind of just like, fighting first and asking questions later.
Yeah.
And I do think kind of the biggest thing of her journey that I wanted to get across was that sort of like asking for help is okay. and that emotions are not a sign of weakness. Oftentimes they're a sign of strength. And I think the other kind of more like hidden, they're not necessarily hidden, but things that I'd like people to get is sometimes, changes in kind of behavior like that takes a while. I think that, there is a lot of times this expectation of like, oh, it's a character arc, so the character should be totally different by the end of the
Yes.
book.
Yeah.
And that's not really something I wanted to do because I just didn't think that that was realistic for Gigi
Yeah.
or, for
Yeah.
most of
Or
us.
for any of us. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Where I wanted, after, her character arc, her to end in a place where change is possible and where she still learns and is different, but, she isn't a totally different person at the end of
Yeah.
the book.
Yeah.
It's more that she's opening herself up and allowing for that work to be done. And I do think that that's kind of an important thing to realize too, because, a lot of like my books might take like in a span of like a few weeks or like it's not a super
Yeah.
long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So like to expect yourself to be able to just kind of realize something and then totally change your ways, for the
Yeah.
better
Yeah.
isn't super realistic. So I think it is kind of important to note that while it's like, yeah, it's great to like learn sort of lessons or realize where you can improve yourself, but that kind of thing takes time. And
Yeah.
I think that's sort of the thing that is the more like hidden message that I
Yeah.
hope some people can get.
I like that a lot because I honestly think that, like the struggles that we have, some of them we end up working our whole lives on. So,
Right.
like, you've got to show character growth, but I also think it's nice when it's realistic character growth
Right. And not just like
instead of,
everything
oh, I
is
went to the
solved.
counselor and then everything was all better forever and ever. It's like,
Right.
yeah, that would be nice, but
Right. I was like, I wish it worked that way, but unfortunately not.
so now we'll jump out to the bigger
Okay.
picture. Um, and not everybody watching will have heard this, but one of your books, The Otherwoods, was a Stonewall Honor book, which was so
Yes.
exciting. Like we were all so excited in the bookstore that day because yours was there, and there were 3 or 4 others that were like, "Oh, we know who that author is," or "We've done something." We were just like, it was like, "Oh, all of our extended family is getting
Right.
awards, and we're very excited." But I'm curious, like, I also know that that kind of stuff can be a little surreal and kind of take a bit to sink in and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm wondering, now that you've had a little time to process, like, in what way has that been meaningful to you? And has that impacted work in any way? Or is it just like, yay, and you just keep doing what you're doing because honestly, that's kind of what you were doing already?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely does like feel surreal. I feel like in the moment, and especially I'm, being on Pacific time when it was like first announced. I mean, I did like hear beforehand, but still to actually like see it in the ceremony, it was like 5 a.m. for me.
Yeah,
So I tried to
yeah.
like get up early and was like watching on my phone. So it did feel like very surreal. And then I still went into work that day and I was like, now I really miss coffee. But it was just so cool. And I think especially to be like I never really considered or thought I would be like the kind of author that would be up for like awards. I was like, oh, I write silly genre
Yeah,
stuff, So like
yeah, yeah,
it was like shocking, but just like very cool to sort of see that it was able to be honored and like seen in that way and kind of
yeah,
like past the humor that they were able to really see the heart in the representation and especially to be honored as like a queer author was just like so meaningful for me. I didn't always have like the best experience coming out as queer and things have gotten a lot better, but kind of being able to like have this and sort of think back to like myself in the past that was in a really bad place and like see how far I was able to come through like not giving up was just incredibly special and like still is. Feel like it was just like recently that I was able to actually like see a copy with like the seal on it because a
yeah,
lot of them
yeah,
still like don't have it. So that felt very kind of like surreal where it's
yeah,
like, oh, it's not
yeah.
just an image on my computer that I updated on my
It's a
website.
sticker.
So yeah, just especially like to be that honor just meant,
Yeah,
so much to me. And even, just for like kids that are a fan of the book to kind of like be able to see that, or maybe like be able to pick up the book because their parents might be like, oh, it won an award, or
Yeah,
make
yeah,
it seem a little more worth the investment. Is just an absolute honor. But especially to for it to be just seen for the queer representation, and especially like for like a horror fantasy book to be
yeah,
seen in an
yeah,
award that isn't horror fantasy, because
yeah.
I feel
No,
like a
I
lot of times
thought
like
that was awesome.
genre books can be sort of like overlooked in those types of things, because you know there is such strong and amazing rep in like contemporary
Yeah,
work, especially
yeah,
for queer fiction. And I hope that, you know, while that recognition continues, that there could also like continue to be more recognition, and especially the horror space, because I feel like
yes,
so
yeah.
many queer authors are just doing incredible things with horror, and it's just
Yeah, no, I
really
totally
exciting to
agree.
see.
I think it's really been fun to see genre fiction kind of sneaking into the awards, the different awards, because I feel like there's so much amazing work going on there. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember having conversations with my kids when they were younger, middle school, high school, doing lit, and we would have conversations about why doesn't comedy ever win awards, or why, like
Right.
why does it have to be this, serious literary
Mm-hmm.
work that wins the awards? And even though there's all this amazing writing happening in these other spaces. And so it's very fun for me to see that start to be represented. But yeah, I think that seeing Otherwoods be honored that way was really special, just because yeah, it's a fantasy, and it's a
You're
horror
right.
fantasy, and it's didn't set out to be like very serious and literary. It set out to be an adventure, and it like being a story of a queer character is central to the character in some ways, but it's also just this really cool fantasy adventure. So having
Right.
those together was just that was very cool. We were very excited.
Yeah, and I realized I didn't really answer the second part in terms of
Oh,
like
that's
if it
okay.
has an effect. But I will say, like, obviously, like it is great. I'm honored. It does sort of like set expectations a little higher
Yeah.
for the follow
Yeah,
up.
that's
So I
hard.
am like sort of like, now that we're about like 3 months out for Wishbone, I'm like, oh man, like how are the trade reviews going to be, or like, you know, like kind of
Yeah,
real, what
yeah.
will the initial response be? But I'm also just trying to keep focused. I really love Wishbone.
Yeah.
I'm like, you know, I'd be excited to talk more about that. I think that one might even be a little more personal in some ways than like the Otherwoods was. So I'm excited to get that out in the world. But
Yeah.
I will say the Otherwoods did kind of set the bar a little higher than
Yeah,
that, you know,
that
for
is
an anxious
hard.
person,
Yeah.
you do sort of like worry of like, oh, will my follow up kind of like, you
Yeah.
know, not be
Yeah.
enough, or not do as well. But kind of just have to keep the mindset of like, you know, I just got to keep
Yes.
working on the
Yeah.
next thing
You,
too.
yeah.
And like,
I think ultimately it's like you just have to be like, well, this is what I do, and I'm just going to keep doing it,
right. And like
and
whether
it's
or not you
okay if
sort of,
not every single one of them is
right.
like, the most amazing thing ever. It's just,
Right. And like what I try to like, you know, tell even my friends and stuff too, is like everything is so subjective too, that if I was, you
yeah.
know, picking honors for something or writing a review of something, it might be totally different than another
Yes.
person.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
like whether or not you're getting kind of accolades, obviously it's amazing if you do, but if not, that doesn't mean there aren't people out there
Exactly.
and kids
Yeah.
out there that are like, this is my new favorite book, you know, and that's what we're
Yes.
really writing
Yeah,
for.
exactly.
So
Exactly. No, I totally agree, because, you could have a panel of judges who are amazing and pick a group of books, and then next year you could have a panel of judges who are also amazing, who
right.
wouldn't have picked that group of books because they're
They're
and
just they're
it
different people.
really is
Yeah.
kind of it's not a crapshoot in a bad way, but I mean it is subjective, and you do have
Mm-hmm.
people with different tastes, or people that things hit differently or whatever. And so anyway, but it's very cool that it was picked out of all the things.
Yes.
And that actually we actually just kind of segued into the next thing, because I know a little bit about what's coming up, but can you talk a little bit about, Wishbone's coming, and Wishbone is another middle grade.
Yeah.
And then, but I know you have another YA coming out too.
Yeah, so I have so with Wishbone, that is another kind of spooky middle grade, with a cat as a prominent character for those who loved Mr. Fluffy Pancakes. But that follows Ollie, who's a trans boy who kind of, also is dealing with his own anger and kind of tension at home. But he's very close to his older sister, Mia, and the two of them are at the beach when they come across some very strange happenings and a two-tailed cat that they name Wishbone, who has the ability, they later find out, to grant wishes. Which is amazing, except for every wish they grant, kind of opposite bad curses start happening the more wishes that they make, the worse things get. So it's
Oh
a book that is
no.
very special to me. I'm really excited for that. I also do have a short horror story in a YA anthology.
Yes.
So The House Where Death Lives, that's out early August from Page Street. That anthology basically follows it's kind of the layout of one house, but each story takes place in a different room in
Oh,
kind of
that's
like a
gonna be
spooky,
fun.
expensive manner.
Yeah.
And each room kind of has its own unique monster. A lot of them are based off of like authors kind of like personal, like ethnic backgrounds or lore. My story deals kind of with the grief of losing a loved one and music. But it also kind of was inspired by my Italian heritage, and
Oh,
different
fun.
stories about witches and stegas that kind of I was told. And I did take some creative liberties, but it is kind of just, yeah, a spooky story with a terrifying witch that takes place in a music room, and I'm really excited for that to be shared. I also will have like some more projects coming up in the future, but unfortunately there's nothing I can talk about just
Yeah,
yet, but
that's
I'm
okay.
hoping very
Yes.
soon.
Yay.
So,
Good. Well, that'll be exciting. You do have to solemnly swear
yeah.
that there will be cats. Let's see, what did I write? Can you solemnly swear there will always be a cat in your books?
Yeah, no, I can honestly solemnly swear that there will always be a cat. I cannot say the cat will always be a main character, but there always will be a cat.
Well, the
My
cat really isn't a main character in this book, but
right,
the
but
cat is very
there are.
important. You have to read all the way to the end to get to
Yeah.
the cat. But the cat is the inspiration for one of my absolute all-time favorite lines in a book ever. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because you got to read it to the end to find out. But yeah,
Yeah, and it was
there's a
funny.
cat in
I
the book.
like my agent was talking to me one time and she's like, Justine, at some point you have to like commission art of just all of the cats from
Oh,
like your different
that would be
books.
so
And
awesome.
I'm like, I have to find like a good timing to do it, but I
Yeah,
would love to because there's
that is
always a
excellent
cat and the
idea.
cat will always be okay at the end because
Oh, good. Okay.
I
Well, yeah,
can't
because it
I
would be
can't
bad
have
if
it
the cat
otherwise.
wasn't. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so, so much. This was so fun. And I'm so excited about the next ones. And I'm so excited about readers getting to read One Killer Problem.
Yeah, thank you so much
Yeah,
for having me.
you're welcome. And I will tell everybody out there we have 3 more weeks of Vintage Books Live before we take a little bit of a break. And next week I'll be talking to local author, mystery author Gary Corbin. He has a new book coming out, or just came out in a series that has been a long-running series that we've had in the store. But from COVID and everything else, there wasn't laid an installment in the series for a really long time. So we're excited that we have that. And Portland Book Week is next week. We're part of the book crawl. I think they're now up over 50 bookstores that are participating. So be sure to pick up your bingo card so that you can play book crawl and look for all the events on the Portland Book Week's website. Blech, too many W's in that sentence. But thank you again for joining us and have a really good